If you had asked Americans at the height of the war to name the country's biggest industrial owner, you would have heard the familiar names: Ford, General Motors, United States Steel. Every one of those answers would have been wrong. The largest holder of industrial plant in wartime America was a corporation that did not exist when the fighting began in Europe, never hired a factory worker, and never machined a single part. Most of the people building bombers and tanks inside its buildings had no idea whose name was on the deed. That name sat on aircraft plants the size of small cities, on rubber works and aluminum mills, on the machine tools bolted to their floors. And when the war ended, nearly all of it went up for sale. Who created that corporation and why? Why did the most powerful industrial nation on Earth decide that private companies should run its war factories but never owned them? And what happened to all that property once the shooting stopped? The answers reach past the war itself into the shape of the American economy you are living in today. The first time Washington bought a war from private industry, it signed contracts that repaid a company every dollar it spent and then added a profit calculated as a percentage of those costs. In 1917, the logic looked reasonable. Nobody knew what a shell plant or a shipyard should cost, so the government agreed to discover the price together with the builder. The flaw sat in plain sight. The more a contractor spent, the more profit the formula produced. Under that arrangement, waste stopped being a failure of the system and became its best-paid feature. The most expensive lesson came from the sky. Congress voted a spectacular appropriation to build an American air fleet on the promise that the country that had invented the airplane would fill Europe's skies with them. Some of the money was spent honestly, and some of it was not. But the accounting hardly mattered next to the outcome. When the war ended, American pilots at the front were flying mostly French and British designs. Roughly $1 billion had bought engine factories, organization charts, and a scandal. It had not bought an air force. The rest of the bills came in about the way you would expect. Some plants doubled their budgets. Some shipyards delivered vessels after the armistice had already made them pointless. Congress spent years of the 20s auditing the wreckage, and the phrase that stuck to the era was war millionaires, men whose fortunes had been assembled inside a single short war. When it was over, the country was left feeling it had been billed twice, once in money and once in the suspicion that somebody had done very well out of all that dying. The Depression turned that suspicion into doctrine. A country standing in breadlines had little patience left for the men who had banked the last war. And in 1934, two writers, Helmuth Engelbrecht and Frank Hannigan, handed the resentment a name it could carry. Their book was called Merchants of Death. It moved through the Book of the Month Club into hundreds of thousands of American homes, and it recast the armorer not as a supplier of national defense, but as a breed of businessman whose market was the graveyard. The title did the work 1,000 pages of hearings never could. For the first time, the American arms business had a public name, and the name was an accusation. The Senate gave the mood a committee. For the better part of 2 years, Gerald Nye of North Dakota walked munitions executives and their bankers through wartime ledgers in front of the newsreel cameras. And out of those hearings came the era's arithmetic of outrage, including Nye's claim that the last war had minted 21,000 new millionaires. Nobody could verify the number, which was part of its power. The hearings produced few prosecutions and no proven conspiracy, but they fixed an idea at the center of American politics. Profit and war were a chemistry the Republic could not survive twice. By the middle 30s, the mood had soaked all the way down to the campuses. A group of Princeton students founded an organization called the veterans of future wars, and demanded their war bonuses immediately, on the sensible reasoning that they would be dead before collecting them. Chapters opened at colleges across the country. It was a joke, and it was not. A generation raised on merchants of death had run the numbers on its own life expectancy and asked to be paid up front. And this time, the country wrote the lesson into law. Neutrality Acts walled American money off from foreign wars. Congress wrote profit ceilings directly into contracts for warships and military aircraft, so that even legal earnings on armaments now came with a statutory limit. Session after session, lawmakers filed bills under a slogan that sounded like a promise carved in granite: take the profit out of war. If the fighting ever returned, the arsenal would run on patriotism and cost accounting, and no one would get rich off it again. So by the spring of 1940, the United States had built something no other great power carried into rearmament: a legal architecture designed, plank by plank, to make war a bad business. The public believed in it. The men about to run the mobilization had spent a decade helping to build it. Almost none of it would survive the year. The architecture came down in 1940, and the strangest thing about the demolition is who performed it. No invading army repealed those statutes. No pro-business Congress swept in and gutted them. The men who suspended the safeguards were, to a remarkable degree, the same men who had spent the 30s building them. And they did it in a matter of months, mostly in public, mostly to applause. A country that had sworn to take the profit out of war was about to sign the most profit-protected contracts in its history. What changed was the map. In the second week of May, the German army went into France, and the French army, which every American war plan treated as the wall behind which the United States could rearm at leisure, collapsed in 6 weeks. The assumption underneath 2 decades of American defense thinking evaporated between spring planting and the summer solstice. Whatever the oceans were still worth, time had stopped being a free good. 6 days after the German attack opened, Roosevelt stood before Congress and asked American industry for 50,000 airplanes a year. The number was not a plan. It was a provocation. In all the years since Kitty Hawk, American companies had built roughly 30,000 planes of every description combined, and the country had exactly 3 suppliers of high-performance aircraft engines. The War Department had not been consulted about the figure and had no idea how it could be met. That was, in a sense, the point. The president had named a number the existing system could not produce, which meant the existing system would have to be replaced. Industry's answer, for most of that summer, was a polite refusal, and it helps to be honest about why, because the reasons were not cowardice and mostly not greed. American manufacturers remembered 1918 in their ledgers. When the last war ended, Washington had canceled contracts wholesale, sometimes with the concrete still curing, and left companies holding specialized plants with no customers and debts with no revenue. The Depression had taught a second lesson. The country already had more factory floor than it had demand, and executives who had spent 10 years nursing idle capacity saw little sense in building more of it for an emergency that might be over before the roof went on. And the tax code agreed with them. A purpose-built defense plant might be scrap in 3 years, but the law let its cost be written off over decades, as if it were an ordinary factory with an ordinary future. On top of the arithmetic sat the politics. These were the same executives the administration had spent a decade investigating, taxing, and denouncing, and some of them had spent that decade denouncing back. Now the same government wanted them to volunteer for the one line of business the country had branded as morally radioactive. A man who built an armaments plant in 1940 was exposing himself to the profit ceilings on the books, to whatever new taxes the emergency would bring, and to the standing risk of a front-row seat at the next round of Merchants of Death hearings. By every rule the country itself had written, refusal was not sabotage, but prudence. Washington read the standoff correctly, and Washington moved first. At the end of May, the president revived a dusty piece of machinery from the last war, an advisory commission on national defense, and seated William Knudsen, the president of General Motors, on it to run industrial production. In July, he handed the War Department to Henry Stimson, a 72-year-old Republican elder who had first sat in a cabinet before most New Dealers could vote.
The signal was hard to miss. The administration was building a bridge to the class it had been prosecuting since the crash. Stimson wrote the new creed into his diary that summer with a bluntness the public messaging never used. If you are going to prepare for war in a capitalist country, he noted, you have got to let business make money out of the process, or business will not work. The legislation followed the personnel. In August, the tax committees of Congress opened joint hearings on a package whose official title told the whole story of the year: excess profits taxation, amortization, and suspension of the Vinson-Trammell Act. The profit ceilings the 30s had written into warship and aircraft contracts, the legal core of the vow, were to be switched off for the duration. In exchange, the Treasury got a tax on excess profits, steep on paper, engineered with enough options and exceptions that a competent accountant could usually find the exit.
The House passed the bill after roughly 2 hours of floor debate. The President signed it on the 8th of October. It had taken the United States 2 decades to build a legal architecture against war profit. Dismantling it took 2 months of hearings and a signature. The elegance of the trade was that nobody had to admit anything had died. The ceilings were suspended, never repealed. The new tax let every senator say that war profits now faced rates the 30s never dreamed of. And the vow lived on as rhetoric, precisely because it had stopped operating as law. In Washington, that is what a funeral for a principle looks like. The principle gets promoted to a slogan. Knudsen, meanwhile, had left the largest manufacturing job on earth for a government post with no legal authority and no salary worth naming. And he would not come to Washington alone. Who followed him and what they did there is a subject we will come back to. Before the men could matter, the paper had to change. The instrument that actually rebuilt the relationship between American business and the American state turned out to be neither a speech nor an appointment, but a contract form. A few pages of standard language with one number fixed in advance. It deserves to be read slowly. Every era leaves behind one document that explains it better than the speeches do. For the American war economy, that document is neither the Atlantic Charter nor the Declaration of War, but a contract form, the cost plus fixed fee agreement. A few dozen pages of standard language that the War and Navy departments began signing in the first summer of the emergency. I have read a fair amount of institutional paperwork, making sense of this period, and I keep returning to this form because everything else, the factories, the fortunes, and the fights ahead, grows out of its clauses. So let's read it the way a manufacturer's lawyer would have read it that summer, slowly, and with an eye for what is missing. Its ancestor, the contract of the last war, ran on a simple engine. The government repaid whatever a company spent and added a profit computed as a percentage of that spending, and we watched what that engine did. The new form kept the first half of the bargain and rebuilt the second. Costs would still be reimbursed, every documented dollar of them, but the profit became a fee fixed in advance,
calculated from the estimated cost of the job at signing, and frozen there in dollars. If the work ran over the estimate, the fee did not grow by a cent. That was the reform, and it was a real one. Congress buried the old formula in statute language of unusual bluntness. The cost plus a percentage of cost system of contracting shall not be used. That sentence is still on the books today. Read only that far, and the paper looks like a lesson learned, the ancient incentive to waste surgically removed. Which is true. A contractor under the new form gained nothing by padding costs because the fee was deaf to them. But keep reading, because the clause that fixed the profit did nothing to the other half of the machine. Every documented cost still flowed back to the contractor, whatever it turned out to be. An estimate wrong by a quarter was the government's problem. A schedule that slipped a year was the government's problem. The fee arrived on the sound work and on the shoddy, on the early delivery and on the late. The form had cured the incentive to inflate costs, and it had preserved, untouched, the freedom to incur them. The question a manufacturer's lawyer is paid to ask comes next. What does my client actually risk here? Under the ordinary rules of commerce, a company taking on a job this size staked its working capital, its credit, and the resale value of whatever it built to do the work. Follow each of those exposures through the new form and watch them disappear. Working capital. By explicit statute, the government could advance up to 30 cents on the dollar of the contract price before the first part was machined. Materials, labor, overhead, reimbursed as spent. And the fee, capped by law at 6 or 7 cents on each dollar of estimated cost, depending on the statute, and usually negotiated lower, looks modest only until you notice what it is measured against. Measured against sales, it is a thin margin. Measured against the capital the contractor himself had actually put at hazard, it approached the mathematics of infinity, because the denominator was approaching zero. Meanwhile, the tax code, which had spent the 30s arguing against building anything, was rewritten to argue for it. The October package that suspended the profit ceilings also created a 5-year amortization schedule for certified defense plant. A factory or a machine tool that would ordinarily be written off over 2 decades or more could now be expensed at 20% a year, provided a certificate declared it necessary to national defense. For a corporation with wartime earnings to shelter, that schedule was worth nearly as much as the contract itself. Taxable profit went down on paper, while physical capacity went up in fact. And if the emergency ended early, the write-off had already been banked. Accountants noticed at the time that management had been handed a double advantage: deflated taxable earnings on one side, and an enlarged earning plant on the other. That was not a loophole, but the design. One more thing had quietly changed hands. These contracts were not put out for bids. There was no time, and for much of this equipment, no second supplier to bid against, so prices were negotiated across a table, cost estimates standing in for a market. The discipline that competition used to supply would now be supplied, in theory, by audit. The government acquired the right to inspect the contractor's books, and behind every major contract grew a column of accountants checking invoices against allowable cost. Even after Pearl Harbor, when a War Powers Act dissolved most remaining formalities and let the departments rewrite agreements almost at will, the enabling order carried one explicit carve-out. The old percentage formula stayed banned. The system would forgive nearly anything except a return to its ancestor. In place of a price system, now stood a paperwork system, and the two are different kinds of thing. A market price is a fact. You take it or you leave it. An allowable cost is a conclusion, and conclusions can be argued into shape. In fairness to the men who drafted all this, the machine was never as naked as its critics would later paint it. The fee had a statutory ceiling. The excess profits tax stood behind it, ready to claw back the most visible gains. Within 2 years, Congress would add a blunter tool still, the power to go back into finished contracts and pull the profit back out of them after the fact. And we will meet that machinery later, because it mattered. But notice the shape of every one of those breaks. Each acted on profit, after the fact, at the margin. None acted on risk. A contractor might argue with Washington for years about how much he would make. Whether he could lose had been settled on page 1. That settlement is the quiet revolution hiding in the form. For as long as commerce has existed, the possibility of loss has been the tax reality levies on every decision, the force that closes bad factories and prices every promise. In the summer of 1940, the United States government, needing the impossible from men who remembered the last time, agreed to collect that tax itself. Not as charity, and not because anyone had been bought, but as a price. Negotiated clause by clause, for speed it could not obtain any other way. The manufacturers gave up their margins, their privacy, and soon enough their nameplates on the factory doors. In exchange, they received the one commodity no market had ever sold before. Washington had bought the risk. The fee settled what a company could earn. It did nothing about the other half of the refusal, the plants themselves. Somebody still had to put up the bricks, and every argument from that first summer still held. Banks would not lend against a factory with one customer, and no board of directors wanted to own a bomber plant in whatever world came after the emergency. The contract had answered the question of profit. The question of property was still open. And the answer Washington found for it was the strangest of the war. If private capital would not own these factories, then private capital would not have to. The government would. The man who closed that loop was neither a general nor an economist, but a banker from Houston. Jesse Jones had run the government's depression lending machine since the early 30s, a Texan who had built a good part of his city's skyline before coming to Washington, and who controlled so much federal credit that half the Capitol called him, not entirely as a joke, Jesus H. Jones. His pride, the thing he repeated to committees for years, was that his agency lent billions and lost almost nothing. He read balance sheets the way other men read faces, and he did not forgive losses. This is the man the emergency now asked to underwrite the largest industrial gamble in American history. A banker whose reputation rested on never losing a nickel of public money, assigned to buy every risk the private sector refused to hold. Congress had already widened his charter that June, and in late August, his agency spun up a subsidiary built for exactly this work. The new corporation made nothing and employed no factory hands. It had no brand, no products, and no history. A checkbook wearing articles of incorporation. What it did was pay for things and hold title to them. They called it the Defense Plant Corporation. That was the name on the deeds. The mechanics fit on an index card. The corporation bought the land, financed the buildings, and purchased the machine tools down to the last lathe, and kept legal title to all of it. A private company designed the plant, staffed it, and ran it under lease, taking its management fee through the same cost-plus arithmetic we have just read. The government owned, the contractor operated. The era even coined a bureaucratic label for the arrangement. Government owned, contractor operated, which had the advantage of being exactly true. The ownership was not a formality either. It was stamped into the hardware. 80 years later, Machinists and collectors still turn up lathes and milling machines carrying small brass tags that read, Defense Plant Corporation, the calling card of a landlord most of its tenants' workers never knew they had. The scale of what that checkbook then did has few parallels in American history. In the last war, the government had directly financed about $1 in 10 of new industrial plant. In this one, it financed 2 out of every 3, out of roughly $25 billion of wartime industrial expansion. The Defense Plant Corporation alone put around $7 billion into more than 2,000 projects, about half of it, one way or another, into aviation. It built the capacity that made synthetic rubber a domestic industry, doubled and redoubled aluminum, and bought so many machine tools that federal brass tags outnumbered some makers' civilian output. Its single largest project, an aircraft engine complex on the edge of Chicago run by Dodge, cost $176 million and could swallow raw metal at one end and ship finished engines out the other. By the middle of the war, the biggest industrial landlord in the United States was the United States. And the model worked, most visibly where the job was strangest. Outside Detroit, Chrysler agreed to mass-produce tanks, a machine it had never built, in a government-owned plant that did not yet exist. And by most accounts, the first tanks rolled out while parts of the building were still waiting for a roof. Nobody involved pretended this was ordinary business. It was a public estate run by private managers, and it was pouring out armor. The showcase, though, the place where the whole bargain was supposed to prove itself in front of the cameras, sat on farmland west of Detroit at a creek called Willow Run. Ford, the loudest name in American mass production, would build heavy bombers there the way Dearborn built cars, on government land, in a government building, with government machine tools, under an assembly line laid out by Charles Sorensen that ran just short of a mile. The premise was irresistible. Detroit's method applied to the hardest manufacturing problem on earth, and out of it came the phrase that captured the country: a bomber an hour. The first year did not deliver a bomber an hour, and the distance between the promise and the floor was paid by the people on it. The plant stood far from the city, an hour's drive on wartime tires, and the housing simply was not there. Workers lived in trailer camps and rented rooms in shifts, and by many accounts, some slept in their cars between shifts. Thousands came from out of state, learned aircraft work from a standing start, and quit when the arithmetic of rent and gasoline stopped working, so the company found itself training its workforce over and over. The method struggled too. A bomber was not a car. The design kept changing under combat feedback, while the hard steel dies that made Ford's system fast made every change slow. Output through much of 1942 came as a trickle. And the newspapers, watching the most publicized factory in America under-deliver, took to calling the place, "Will It Run?" None of that was a scandal of greed. It was what it looks like when a promise made in a press release is redeemed by exhausted people in an unfinished landscape. Then, slowly, the machine caught. The dies stabilized, the housing followed, the workforce settled. And by 1944, the line at Willow Run was doing the impossible thing on the poster. At its peak, a finished Liberator every hour. The bottleneck moved to the runway. Ferry crews waited on rows of cots by the field for bombers to come off the line. And there is the whole arc of the place in one image. A plant that began with workers sleeping in cars for want of houses, ended with pilots sleeping on cots for want of nothing except more hours in the day. Through all of it, the deed never moved. The line, the roof, the mile of concrete, the tools that finally found their rhythm. Every brick of the most famous factory in America belonged not to Ford, but to a corporation in Washington with no employees on the floor. Keep hold of that fact. It becomes important the moment the shooting stops. Step by step, then, the arrangement nobody had planned as a system became one. Risk had moved to the Treasury, now title had followed it. The arsenal of democracy, at the level of the property records, was substantially a government estate, operated by the most famous names in American capitalism, on land they did not own, with tools they did not buy, at a profit they could not lose. If that machinery is why you are watching, one practical note. This channel runs on viewers who want their history told through its paperwork, and subscribing is the simplest way to tell us to keep building it. Knutson, as promised, did not come alone. Through the last months of 1940 and into the following year, the agencies charged with arming the country filled with men on loan from the companies that would build the arms. Steel men took desks in the steel branch, oil men in petroleum, automobile men wherever the work touched Detroit. They were, by every resume measure, the most qualified procurement staff any government had ever assembled. And nearly every one of them carried the same anomaly in his file: 2 employers, one of which was selling to the other. The anomaly had a legal shape, and the shape explains the era. An old federal statute forbids the government to accept volunteer labor. Every servant of the United States must be paid something, if only to fix where his duties legally lie. So the lawyers reached for the smallest salary the law would recognize. The executives were hired at $1 a year, which made them lawful federal officials, while their real salaries, the 5- and 6-figure kind, went on being paid by the corporations they came from. None of this was concealed. It was printed, debated, and defended on the record, which is the detail to hold on to. The conflict of interest was not a flaw buried somewhere inside the system, but the staffing plan itself. The case for doing it this way was real, and honesty owes it a hearing. The government needed to buy things no civil servant had ever bought, from firms whose true capacities no ledger in Washington described. The men who knew which plant could hold a tolerance, which supplier padded estimates, and what a fair price for a forging looked like were, almost without exception, employed by industry, and for the best of them, the highest salary the government could legally offer came to less than 1/10 of what their companies already paid. Strict conflict rules would have produced a procurement corps of the pure and the ignorant. The emergency chose knowledge instead, and knowledge came with a return address. The question of what the knowledge bought has a precise answer. Between 1940 and 1944, the United States placed about $175 billion in prime war contracts, and the geography of that money may be the most eloquent document the era produced. 2/3 of it went to just 100 corporations. 1/5 of it went to 5. No investigation of the period ever proved a contract corruptly steered, and the observation that matters is simpler and harder to prosecute. People allocate toward what they know and trust, and what these men knew and trusted was big, familiar, and shaped like the companies still paying their salaries. A contract with no downside made the habit costless. Betting on the giants asked nothing extra of the government, and the giants, conveniently, had men in the room. The other side of that ledger was everyone else. Small manufacturers by the tens of thousands watched the money pass overhead, idled or living on subcontract scraps, until Congress grew alarmed enough in the middle of 1942 to charter a rescue agency just for them. The rescue mattered less than its paperwork. The sharpest numbers on contract concentration, the ones I just read you, come out of the government's own reporting on the problem, which means the system counted what it was doing to the little firms with great precision and kept doing it. Friction came from inside the building first. Officials without industry ties charged, in resignations and in sworn testimony, that dollar-a-year men from the consumer industries were slow to convert their own sectors to war production, sheltering the markets they expected to return to when it ended. The Senate's new Watchdog Committee, which we are about to meet properly, put the whole class under scrutiny more than once and came away holding two findings that refused to merge: a documented catalog of delay and divided loyalty, and a concession that the machine could not run without these men. Accusation and dependence in the same breath. That tension never resolved, because it could not. The men were indispensable, and they were compromised, and both things were true on every day of the war. Who they were as individuals, the empires some of them built inside the agencies, the fights they picked with the generals and with each other, and where the most famous of them landed a decade after the war. All of that has an architecture of its own and deserves its own telling rather than a paragraph here. For now, the function is what matters. The buying side of the largest transaction in human history was staffed, at its expert level, by the selling side. The pieces now sit side by side, and the design reads complete. Profit had been replaced by a fee, property by a lease, the marketplace by an audit, and the buyer's own judgment, the last safeguard classical commerce provides, by an expert on loan from the seller. What makes the arrangement worth studying is that it required no secrecy and no crime. It ran as open policy, adopted for stated reasons, one defensible decision at a time, by men who could explain every step, and the explanations were usually good ones. That is what a system looks like when nobody needs to break a rule, because the rules have been rewritten to fit. Washington had bought the risk. A machine this large, running on reimbursed costs and audited honesty, needed a feedback loop, and the Senate built one almost by accident. In late 1940, a freshly re-elected senator from Missouri started hearing from constituents about waste at the new Army camps, got in his car, and went to look, and by his own telling, put 10,000 miles behind him driving from site to site. What he saw was the cost-plus economy at ground level. Contractors billing for idle men, equipment rented at fantasy rates, nobody in the chain with a reason to say no. In March of 1941, the Senate gave Harry Truman a special committee to investigate the defense program, and it did so with more than one motive. An audit of the war effort was coming, one way or another, and the Senate preferred its own sober version to the hostile one brewing across the Capitol. By the famous accounting, the committee began with a budget of $15,000. It was the cheapest component the war machine ever acquired. It ran unlike anything else in the building. Truman banned grandstanding, shared credit with Republicans, refused to touch military strategy, and put facts on the record at a pace that made the committee impossible to dismiss. The hearings walked through camps and cargo ships, aluminum and rubber, and, as we saw, the dollar-a-year men themselves. By the committee's own estimates and those of later scholars, its work saved the country somewhere between $10 and $15 billion, against operating costs of a few $100,000 a year. If you believe even the low end of that accounting, it remains the best return on investment any arm of American government has ever produced. But the committee's defining hour came at one plant, and the plant has earned the time we are about to give it. At Lockland, Ohio, on the edge of Cincinnati, stood an aircraft engine works run by Wright Aeronautical, a subsidiary of Curtiss-Wright, then the second largest war contractor in the country behind General Motors. The plant had been built with public money, celebrated in the press, and pointed at the sky. Its engines went into bombers and into the trainers where new pilots learned their trade. In January of 1943, letters reached the committee from Army inspectors stationed inside that plant. What they alleged, and then repeated under oath when a subcommittee came to Cincinnati in the spring, described a production system that had stopped telling itself the truth. Test results falsified, inspection reports forged, records destroyed, tolerances quietly widened, and inspectors who balked, finding themselves overruled, reassigned, or denied the rejection stamps that were the only authority they had. The committee reported that more than a quarter of the engines built at the plant had been failing a basic 3-hour test in one or more major parts. And behind the paperwork stood the thing nobody in the hearing room needed explained. These were engines for military aircraft, many of them trainers, and the men who would fly behind them were mostly very young and still learning how. The inspectors testified that they thought about those men. It is why some of them had refused to sign, and why, when the stamps were taken from their hands, a few of them wrote to the Senate instead. The company answered at full volume. Its president declared the charges false and unwarranted, and insisted the corporation had never knowingly delivered a defective product to anyone. The committee's report of July 1943 was unsparing anyway, and its phrase for the plant's inspection practices was gross negligence. Then the record refuses to stay simple, and honesty requires following it. The War Department's leadership publicly judged the affair less sensational than the headlines. A review board conceded the committee's facts while disputing their weight. And when the Army's own engineers later tracked the service histories of engines from the plant across hundreds of flying hours apiece, they concluded that in the field, the engines had performed satisfactorily. The government still sued the subsidiary and named 10 of its executives. Accounts then and since have linked Lockland engines to training crashes. The committee documented the practices. The link to specific losses was contested then, and it is contested now. And we will leave it where the record leaves it. The affair sank deep enough into the country's memory that it is often cited as an inspiration for Arthur Miller's play about a manufacturer of defective aircraft parts, All My Sons. What the file supports, 80 years on, is a documented accusation and a documented defense. What it does not support is the comfortable version in which nothing was wrong. What the scandal changed and what it left alone is the heart of the Watchdog's paradox. Managers were replaced, inspection regimes were rebuilt, careers ended, and the deterrent ran through every contractor in the country. Every acceptance test in America became harder to lean on. The contract form came through without a scratch. The committee's power was exposure, and exposure fixes men. And the system was never made of men. Every abuse absorbed and corrected became evidence that the machine could police itself. And the more evidently it could police itself, the more permanent it deserved to be. Oversight, far from threatening the design, completed it. And if by this point you have quietly concluded that profits simply ran wild behind all this, the ledger has a correction for you, and it is the strangest turn in the whole account. In the spring of 1942, Congress had given the government a power no peacetime legislature would have dreamed of: the right to reopen a signed contract after the work was done and take back whatever profit it judged excessive. And the Supreme Court blessed it when the inevitable challenge came. Billions flowed back to the Treasury through that channel, on top of an excess profits tax that reached 90 cents on the marginal dollar. Somewhere inside that plumbing lives the ghost of Gerald Nye. The 30s had tried to take the profit out of war by prohibition and failed in public. The 40s took a large share of it out by audit and clawback, quietly, inside the very machine the 30s had been afraid of. The slogan had died as law and come back as accounting. So the honest summary of this system carries a tension that most retellings drop. War profits in this war were policed, taxed, and recaptured more aggressively than in any conflict in American history. And the men who ran the machinery could prove it with tables. And none of those tables ever touched the founding clause. Profit was negotiable all the way down. The impossibility of loss was negotiable nowhere. That is the apparent contradiction resolving into the actual design. Washington was never buying greed, and it clawed greed back wherever it found it. What it was buying, at the price of everything we have watched it concede, was certainty, and it got what it paid for. The chairman collected a reward nobody in those hearing rooms had predicted.
The senator who spent 3 years auditing the war machine was put on the ticket in 1944, and in April of 1945, the system's most famous critic inherited the system whole. He also inherited its calendar. The fighting was ending faster than the paperwork, and every contract, plant, loan, and lease we have described had been built for a war. What a risk-free economy does when the emergency that justified it disappears was now the open question, and the country was about to answer it in public. The end, when it came faster than the beginning. Within days of the Japanese surrender, termination notices went out by the tens of thousands, canceling contracts worth tens of billions of dollars, and the nightmare that had kept industry out of the war effort in 1940 arrived precisely on schedule. Assembly lines stopped mid-shift.
In the aircraft towns, the layoffs were immediate, and they were brutal. And nothing about that part was abstract for the people living it. But for the companies, the crash landed on cushions because this time the crash had been designed. A settlement law, written a full year before the surrender, laid out how canceled contracts would be paid off, quickly and by negotiation. The advances had long since been banked, the amortization already taken, the fees already earned. The ruin of the last post-war, the stranded plants and the dead debts of 1920 did not repeat itself. Industry had been right to fear the ending, and the system had been built from the first clause to survive it. Which left the property. The United States government stood at the end of the war as the owner of an industrial estate assembled in 5 years of emergency. The plants, the mills, the machine tools with the brass tags. A new agency was chartered to hold the greatest disposal sale in history. Everything from mess kits to shipyards. And at the center of its inventory sat the factories of the Defense Plant Corporation, most of which the government had no peacetime use for, and many of which only one buyer on Earth knew how to run. The company already inside. Willow Run went first through the door we have been holding open. The fact I asked you to hold, that every brick of the most famous factory in America belonged to Washington, now came due. Ford held an option to buy the plant it had built and made famous, and Ford walked away, having no peacetime use for a bomber factory the size of a town. The disposal agency went looking for anyone who did, and found a brand new automaker assembled around the shipbuilder Henry Kaiser, which leased the plant, moved in among the bomber jigs, and then bought the whole thing outright for about $15 million. Construction had cost the public at least $100 million, and by some accountings, closer to double that. The deed that never moved during the war moved once, at a discount steep enough to serve as the epitaph for the entire estate. Because Willow Run was the pattern, and the pattern is worth stating both ways since the books honestly support both. Across the country, wartime operators and newcomers bought government plants for fractions of their construction cost, and the capacity the public had paid for passed into private hands at surplus prices. That is the first reading. And it is true. The second is the treasuries. The war was over. The plants were surplus. Half of them were single-purpose and worth little to anyone. And selling them into the civilian boom at whatever the market would pay put aluminum, synthetic rubber, machine tools, and factory floor onto the post-war economy that was about to astonish the world. A fire sale and a founding endowment can be the same transaction. Which one you see depends on where you stand. And this channel's position is that you should be able to see both from here. The agencies themselves died on schedule, and this matters for the honesty of the account. The production board was dissolved within months of the surrender. The Defense Plant Corporation was folded back into its parent and wound down. On the organization charts, demobilization looks complete, and that is exactly what makes the survival underneath so easy to miss. What persisted was not any office, but the architecture. Negotiated contracts instead of sealed bids for anything complicated. Cost audit as the substitute for price. A permanent core of officials and contractor staffs fluent in each other. And on both sides of the table, the settled expectation that in this market, the customer carries the risk. The emergency machinery was scrapped. The operating system was kept. 5 years after the surrender, a war in Korea switched that operating system back on, and this time it was never fully switched off again. How a temporary arrangement became a permanent condition is its own subject, and it will get its own examination. Which brings us, finally, to the man who closed it. Dwight Eisenhower had commanded the armies this system equipped, and then spent 8 years as president running the system itself, through the budgets, the lobbies, and the contractors of the deep Cold War. No living American knew the machine from more sides. On the 17th of January, 1961, 3 days from leaving office, he gave a farewell address from the White House and used it for a warning. He told the country plainly that it now maintained, for the first time in its history, a permanent arms industry of vast scale, wedded to an immense military establishment, and that this was new in the American experience. He warned against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, and he gave the arrangement the name it has carried ever since: the Military-Industrial Complex. Almost 3 decades separated that phrase from merchants of death. The first name had been an accusation hurled from outside, and accusations need villains. The second was a diagnosis delivered from the inside, and diagnoses describe structures. It came from the one man in America who could not be accused of misunderstanding either the military or the industry. In 27 years, the country had not changed its mind about the problem. It had changed the kind of problem it was. I said at the start that the answers here reach into the economy you live in today. So here is the reflection I owe you. Nothing in this account required a villain. Every clause we read was signed for a reason its signers could say out loud, by men who mostly believed it, under a deadline that was real. And the machine they built produced the weapons, held the alliance, and set the calendar of victory. It also produced a residue no one ordered, a permanent structure in which the state guarantees the market, and the market staffs the state. Too useful to abandon, too entangled to unwind. Named by its own chief executive in the last days of his office as a warning, because a warning was all that was left to give. The purchase at the center of this system was made in the summer of 1940, openly, for stated reasons, at a negotiated price. Washington had bought the risk. It never found a way to sell it back. This has been Strategic Blueprint.